So today is evaluating expressions, but we are going to warm up with a little bit of order of operations because that will be involved in the lesson. So again, I always encourage you to read these through from left to right. That is the opposite of 4 squared minus 10 times 3 minus 4 minus negative 7. So going through the order of operations, we do have parentheses, so I have to do that first. So 3 minus 4 is going to give me a negative 1, and I'm going to keep the parentheses because they also mean multiplication, and I have this 10 out in front of it, and then I'm going to rewrite everything else. When I go back through, my parentheses are done, but now I do have an exponent. That is the opposite of 4 squared, so the only thing I'm squaring is the 4, so that becomes a 16. And I'm going to bring this opposite down, and then I'm going to rewrite everything else. Now I'm at the multiplication level. Remember, when you are multiplying, you always use the sign of the number in front of it. So when I go through this, I'm just going to change colors. That is a negative 10 times a negative 1, and that's going to give me a positive 10. So always use your signs. Now I can cancel out these two negatives sitting next to each other, so that becomes a positive 7. So I'm going to be adding 7, and then I'm going to bring everything else down. So now I'm at negative 16. I move to the right 10 spots. I'm at negative 6. And then I keep moving in that direction another 7 spots. I am at positive 1. So let's just do another one. Remember, this is a division bar. So we're going to do everything on the top and everything on the bottom and divide last. So let's just do the top here and change back to pink. I do have a parenthesis. Inside the parenthesis, it's negative 1 minus 18. So I'm starting at negative 1, moving to the left 18 spots. I am at negative 19. And I'm going to keep the parentheses because I have this strange addition here on the outside. And I am going to go ahead and do this because it doesn't affect anything else. So sometimes you can do things at the same time. So now I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, am I adding a negative or just what is that? So remember, the negative sign is always more powerful. So when I'm thinking about that, I don't need that addition sign. That's actually 9 minus 19. So I'm going to end up at negative 10. So I'm going to bring this over here. And that's a negative 10. That whole thing on top is a negative 10. Change back to pink. I'm going to go through. There are no parentheses. They are only there to say, look at me, I'm a negative, and also to multiply. So when I read it through left to right, it's negative 2 minus negative 3 times negative 1. So I'm going to do that negative 3 times negative 1. So that's a positive 3. I am not going to bring down the plus sign because it just is really confusing. So, you know, that little plus sign's right here, but we're just not going to bother with it. Oops, sorry about that. I erased the wrong thing. So now I'm at negative 2, and I go to the left 3 more spots. I'm at negative 5. A negative divided by a negative is a positive, so my answer is positive 2. We are going to be using the order of operations today, but evaluating expressions, so we are going to be substituting in numbers for variables. This is huge. You've got to remember to do this. When substituting negative numbers into an expression, always put in a parenthesis. So you want to make sure you capture the negative when you substitute it in, because sometimes, with the subtraction, they don't take the place of each other, and you'll see what I mean. So let's come down here. Evaluate the expression for z equals negative 5. So you can see that when I'm looking at this z right here, there's already a negative sign in front of that z, but that would be considered an opposite. So when I read this expression, I'm going to say the opposite of z. So when I substitute that in, this opposite stays there, and then I substitute in negative 5 inside parentheses. So now when I read it, it's the opposite of negative 5. Well, what is the opposite of negative 5? The opposite of negative 5 is positive 5. So you do need to bring them in inside parentheses to capture that negative. So here we have z times z squared. So I have negative 5 times negative 5, and there's my squared. We have to evaluate the exponent first. So I have negative 5 times negative 5. So I have negative 5. Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. And then negative 5 times positive 25, that's going to give me a negative 125. And see down here, this next one says 6 minus z. So this minus does not take the place of this negative. They are both going to be there. So that's why you have to substitute in inside parentheses. So you capture that negative. So it's going to look something like this. So I have 6 minus negative 5. Well, remember, when you are subtracting away a negative, you are really adding it back. And so this answer is going to be 11. So it just really is important that you substitute them in inside parentheses to make sure you are capturing the negative. So let's go. We have A is equals negative 2, B is negative 5, and C is negative 1. So I have the opposite of A minus B. So the opposite of A, and A is negative 2. Then I'm going to subtract B, and B is negative 5. So look at all those negative signs I have in there. So now I can go through, and there are no parentheses, there's no exponents. It's a multiplication problem, which means I can cancel those out. So now I just have 2 plus 5, that is 7. Change back to pink. Let's do 4 times A is negative 2, C is negative 1, and the negative 1 is squared. So before I can multiply, I have to do these exponents. So I'm going to do 4, negative 2, negative 1 times negative 1, that is a positive 1. And now I can just multiply because all my exponents are gone. So this would be a negative 8 times 1, so my answer is negative 8. That really is the key to evaluating expressions when you have negatives, is to substitute them in inside parentheses. Because this negative, or this opposite here in front of this C, does not take the place of this. They both need to be there. So I have the opposite of C, and C is negative 1, times B, which is negative 5, plus A, which is negative 2, squared. I do have a square. Remember, the parentheses are just there to capture that negative. So negative 2 times negative 2, that's a positive 4. I'm going to rewrite everything else. That's important. So now I can go through, because my exponents are gone, I can just go through and look at all these negatives I have up here. I have the opposite of negative 1 times negative 5. Can do this in a couple of different ways. I'm just going to cancel them as I go along. So 2 negatives together, that makes that a positive 1. And now that positive 1 times negative 5, that is a negative 5 plus 4. I'm at negative 5. I go to the right 4 spots. I am at negative 1. So here's B squared. B is negative 5. I'm going to square it. Minus 4 times A is negative 2, and C is negative 1. No parentheses. They're just there to capture the negative. I do have an exponent. So negative 5 times negative 5, that is a 25. I'm just going to rewrite everything else. Remember, when you're multiplying, use the sign in front of the number. So this is actually a negative 4 times a negative 2. Oops, excuse me. So that makes it a positive 8 times a negative 1, and I'm just going to bring the 25 down. I'm still not done, because I have this positive 8 times a negative 1, so that's actually a negative 8. So I really have 25 minus 8, and that is 17. 2 more. So I have the opposite of A squared plus B times C squared. So the opposite of A, and A is negative 2, and I'm going to square it, plus B, which is negative 5, times C, which is negative 1. So don't fall for this trap here at the beginning. I cannot cancel these 2 negatives out because I'm not at the multiplication level. Remember, you have to be at the multiplication level in order to do that. So I've got to do my exponent first. I know that's really tempting. A lot of people want to go do that, but don't do that. This negative is going to come down, or opposite. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. Then I'm going to rewrite everything else. So now a negative 5 times a negative 1, that's a positive 5. I'm at -4. I go to the right 5 spots. I am at +1. So here we go. One more. C is -1. And this one's raised to the third, so we get a chance to talk about that. A is -2. B is -5. C is -1. And then we have minus. A is -2. A lot going on here, but parentheses again, none of them. But let's talk about this raised to the third power. So what I really have here when I'm doing -1 to the third power is I have 3 -1s. Remember, they cancel out in pairs. So these are going to cancel themselves out. So actually -1 to the third is -1 because +1 times +1 is +1 and +1 times -1 is -1. So this actually ends up being a -1. And I'm going to rewrite everything else. Whoops, lost the negative. Now I'm at the multiplication level. So I can get rid of some of these negative things I've got working here. I got a lot of negatives. I can cancel these out, right? So I have -1 plus, well, that's 2 times 5 is 10. 10 minus, or times -1 is -10. And I'm just going to put it in parentheses and we'll talk about it in a sec. And I can go ahead and cancel those out. So that's a +2. Here's that weird thing that I've talked about a couple of times. You don't want to have 2 signs in front of your number. So I have a -1 plus a -10. Well, what's more powerful, the positive or the negative? It is the negative. So I really have -1 minus 10. So I'm at -1. I move to the left 10 spots. I'm at -11. I come back to the right 2 spots. I'm at -9. Here's some absolute values. Remember, absolute value means the pure value of the number that you get when you evaluate the expression inside that absolute value signs. So let's just put them all in here. This is the opposite of the absolute value. I'll do absolute value in red. I try and do that to make it stand out because sometimes it just looks like a number 1 or something. So then A is -2 minus B is -5. C is -1. So let's do what's inside here. There are no parentheses, there's no exponents, so I can just jump right to multiplication. Here are these 2 negatives sitting next to each other, so I can cancel them out. So now I've got 5 times -1, 5 times -1. So I have the absolute value. There's that negative there, and I have the opposite, -2 right here. So +5 times -1, that is a -5. So now if I'm at -2, I'm still on the inside of this absolute value. So I might just rewrite my absolute values. I'm going to do it over here. Give myself a little more room. Here's that opposite. So I'm at -2. I take away 5. I'm at -7. So what is the absolute value of -7? Well, the absolute value of -7, what's the pure value of -7? In other words, how many spaces away from 0 is that -7? It is 7. But then this is an opposite, so that's going to come down. And the answer to this is actually a -7. Because I took the absolute value of -7, which is 7, but then I had to take the opposite of it. So let's look at these absolute values. I'll do them in red. So we have the absolute value of A minus the absolute value of C. Well, A is -2, and C is -1. So what's the pure value of -2? The absolute value of -2 is how far away it is. So the absolute value of -2 is 2. There, bring my subtraction down. The absolute value of -1. So the pure value of -1 is 1. Because it's 1 spot away, so I'm just 2 minus 1, and that is 1. Again, substitute them in. This is the last one, so stick with me. This is the opposite of x, minus y minus 5 squared. So x is -4. I'm just going to switch back and forth here. Y is negative 10, and then I'm going to subtract 5 squared. So I do have a squared here. I am only squaring the 5 because if I read this through, I have the opposite of negative 4 minus negative 10 minus 5 squared. I didn't say negative 5 squared. I said minus 5 squared. So 5 squared is 25. And bring that down and just rewrite everything else. You should get into the habit of doing that because then you don't lose anything in the process. Now I'm only at the multiplication level. Look at all those negatives I have sitting in a row. They're just sitting right next to each other, just waiting to be canceled out. The opposite of negative 4, of course, is positive 4, and the opposite of negative 10 is positive 10. So I really have 4 plus 10 minus 25. So I have 14 minus 25. So I'm all the way up at 14. I take away 25. I am at negative 11. So I hope that makes sense. I think the big takeaways for this is just to make sure you are always substituting inside parentheses when you've got those negatives. Because if you had the opposite of x and x was equal to negative 2, this and this are different. They are not the same thing, and therefore they don't take the place of each other. So what I'd really have is this. So the opposite of x, and x is negative 2, so the opposite of negative 2 is going to be positive 2. So substitute them in, and the order of operations always rules over everything else in math. So substitute them in, and then remember parentheses are grouping symbols, exponents, multiply, divide left to right, add, subtract left to right. Reach out if you have any questions. Let me know.